Emily stood frozen at the entrance of the Grand Hotel ballroom, her heart pounding in her chest, her dress a tangled mess in her hands. The soft hum of the wedding party in the distance felt like a million miles away as her gaze darted around, desperately searching for a way to fix the chaos she had just created. She had been rushing since the very first moment she stepped out of her apartment. The taxi had been late, a complete disaster. And then there was the reckless driver who nearly ran her off the road at the hotel entrance, leaving her heart pounding in her chest. But this was different. This was the moment that would change everything for her. She wasn't just late. She had stumbled into a nightmare that would continue to haunt her for the rest of her life. It was meant to be a simple day, a bridesmaid's job she had already mastered countless times. Help the bride, make sure she stays calm, and give a little speech at the end. But of course, nothing ever went as planned for Emily. She always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, tripping over herself or saying the wrong thing. She had learned to laugh it off, to move on quickly, but today felt different. As she fought to regain control of her dress, the sound of guests' laughter drifted through the hallway. Emily winced as she knew she was running out of time. Her best friend Clara was waiting at the altar and Emily was nowhere near ready. The elevator had been packed, naturally of course, and now the only way to reach the ballroom was up a flight of stairs. She wasn't exactly the picture of grace under pressure, and when she reached the top of the stairs she felt it. Her heels were too high, the fabric of her dress too long, and the floor was far too slippery. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on her. But just as she was about to take another step, it happened. Bam! The force of the collision sent her sprawling, her bouquet flying from her hands and her purse hitting the floor with a resounding thud. She barely managed to stop herself from crashing face first into the marble floor, her breath hitching in her throat. Before she could react, two strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her upright. The moment their bodies connected, everything else seemed to stop. The world slowed as Emily caught a glimpse of the man who had saved her from disaster. His cologne, the rich scent of something expensive, enveloped her, drowning out the chaos. She blinked a few times, trying to make sense of what just happened. And then she saw him clearly. He wasn't elderly, as she had first feared. No, this man was nothing like what she expected. Standing before her was a vision of sophistication. A man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a luxury magazine. Dark hair, a sharp jawline, and piercing blue eyes that pierced through the air like they could see right through her. He was the kind of man who commanded attention with every breath he took, and here he was holding her. "You're late," he remarked, his voice deep and calm, almost amused. Emily felt her cheeks flush at the obvious observation. Of course he would point that out. She was late. She was clumsy. She had just tripped into his arms, ruining her best friend's wedding before it even started. How could she be so careless? Why did she always seem to find herself in these situations? "Thank you, Captain Obvious," she muttered, her voice tinged with sarcasm as she tried to step away from him. But the damage was already done. Her dress was stuck on her heel, and there was no graceful way to free herself. As she stood there, desperately trying to regain her composure, the man crouched, down in front of her without a word. His hands moved with effortless precision as he freed the tangled fabric with one swift motion. "Continue your suicide mission," he said with a slight smirk, his voice laced with something that she couldn't quite identify. Emily took a deep breath, trying to hide the rush of frustration and embarrassment. "I was already on my way before. You decided to stop me," she replied with a quick glance down at the fabric that had caught her heel. The man didn't respond. He simply stood up, straightening his dark suit as if the collision had never happened. Emily grabbed her purse and bouquet, silently cursing under her breath. She wanted nothing more than to get away from this stranger, this man who had somehow managed to turn her entire world upside down in a matter of seconds. But there was something about him, something that tugged at her insides and made her feel seen. His gaze lingered, studying her as if trying to unravel some mystery that she herself didn't understand. He was still watching her, even as she moved away to join the other bridesmaids. His presence was like a magnet, pulling her attention back every time she tried to turn away. Her heart fluttered uncomfortably in her chest as she tried to shake the feeling of being scrutinized. The ceremony began, but all Emily could focus on was the man who had saved her from falling flat on her face. Brian Fisher, a name that echoed in her mind, a name she would never forget no matter how hard she tried. "Who is that?" she whispered to the bridesmaid next to her, desperate to shift her attention away from the man whose gaze was still burning into her. "That's Brian Fisher," her friend answered nonchalantly. "One of the richest men in the country. CEO of a massive consulting firm. And now he's our guest. Emily blinked, stunned. The man who had saved her from a disaster was one of the wealthiest men in the world. Of course, it made sense now. He didn't belong here, at least not in this world. His life was too polished, too perfect. And Emily, well, she was just a clumsy architect trying to survive a wedding without embarrassing herself further. Yet as the ceremony continued, Emily couldn't ignore the pull of his presence. He was there, seated among the groomsmen, his eyes fixed on her with such intensity that it made her feel like the entire room had faded away. He's just looking at me because I made a fool of myself, Emily thought. That's all. He's studying me because I'm an embarrassment. But even as she tried to convince herself otherwise, the knot in her stomach tightened. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him. And she had a sinking feeling that the rest of the night would only get more complicated from here on out. The worst part? She wasn't sure she wanted it to stop. The man she had collided with was more than just a mystery. He was a puzzle, one she knew she wasn't supposed to care about. But something deep inside her couldn't resist. There was something about him that drew her in. Something that spoke to her in a way that nothing else had. And for the first time in a long time, Emily realized that she didn't know if she was prepared for what was about to come next. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air after her collision with Brian Fisher. She told herself it was just the embarrassment of being so clumsy in front of someone like him. But deep down, she knew it was something more. His eyes never left her as she joined the other bridesmaids, and the weight of his gaze seemed to follow her throughout the ceremony. It was as if the whole room faded away whenever their eyes met, and the space between them felt charged, like the crackle of electricity before a storm. The wedding ceremony itself was a blur. She couldn't focus on Clara's vows or the sweet smiles exchanged between the bride and groom. All Emily could think about was Brian Fisher. His intense blue eyes, his calm, confident demeanor, and the mysterious aura that surrounded him. What was it about him that made her feel so out of place? It wasn't just his wealth or status that caught her attention. It was the way he carried himself, the way he observed everything and everyone around him, including her. When the ceremony ended and the guests filed out to head toward the reception, Emily tried to shake the feeling of his eyes lingering on her. But as she walked into the ballroom, she saw him again. Standing by the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking every bit the part of the reserved billionaire CEO he was. He wasn't talking to anyone, just standing there, looking out over the crowd with that same focused gaze. Emily tried to look away, but it was impossible. There was something magnetic about him that made her feel like she was drawn to him, no matter how hard she tried to resist. She could feel the tension building between them, an unspoken connection that both scared and intrigued her. He wasn't like anyone she had ever met before, and she had no idea how to navigate this strange new territory. As she walked toward the bar to grab a drink, she tried to calm her racing heart. She didn't need to get caught up in whatever was happening between them. She had a job to do: help Clara, keep the wedding running smoothly, and avoid any more disasters. But just as she reached for a glass of wine, it happened again. She turned too quickly, and in what felt like slow motion, the wine splashed out of her glass and onto the front of Brian's suit. Her eyes widened in horror as the dark liquid spread across his pristine black jacket, leaving a large stain that was impossible to ignore. She froze, her mind racing to find a way to undo the damage she had caused. "Please tell me this didn't just happen," she muttered under her breath, the panic rising in her chest. Brian glanced down at the stain, then back up at her, his expression unreadable. For a second, Emily thought he might snap at her or even throw her out of the party. But instead, he just let out a soft laugh, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Well, it did," he said simply, his voice calm and composed. "But I'm not going to sue you, don't worry." Emily stared at him, stunned. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mad. He was just calm. Too calm, almost. He was used to this, wasn't he? Used to being the center of attention. Used to people making mistakes around him. Used to the power and control he had over everyone in the room. She could feel the heat rising to her cheeks as the room seemed to close in on her. "I'll grab a napkin," she stammered, fumbling for a way to fix this. "I can clean it up." But before she could do anything, Brian calmly removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves as if this was just another inconvenience to deal with. Emily stood there dumbfounded. Was this really happening? She had just spilled wine all over the most powerful man at the party, and he was acting like it was no big deal. "If you want to make it up to me," he said with a playful glint in his eye. "You could join me at the bar." Emily blinked, unsure of how to respond. Was this an invitation? An attempt at being polite? Or was there something more to it? Whatever the case, she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt towards him. Despite the embarrassment, despite the chaos of the night, there was something about Brian Fisher that was impossible to ignore. She glanced around, trying to figure out what to do. She didn't want to get caught up in some game, some power play. She had never been the type of person to be manipulated by someone's wealth or charm. But at the same time, the idea of spending a few minutes alone with Brian, away from the chaos of the wedding, intrigued her. "Fine," she said after a moment, her voice low. "But I get to choose the drinks." Brian chuckled, his eyes lighting up with amusement. "Surprise me," he said, leaning back against the bar as he gave her a teasing smile. Emily couldn't help but feel a strange mix of excitement and nervousness as she walked up to the bartender and placed her order. She could feel Brian's eyes on her, and the intensity of his gaze made her heart race. She had never felt this way before, not around anyone. It was as if he could see right through her, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. When the drinks arrived, she picked up her whiskey and took a long sip, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She turned back to Brian, who was watching her with a look that was both intense and calculating. "So, Mr. Fisher," she said, trying to sound casual, "why is a high-powered CEO like you at a wedding that clearly doesn't fit your usual style?" Brian swirled his drink in his glass, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I'm the groom's best man," he replied. "And because your social life consists of boring corporate events." Emily raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You think I'm boring?" Brian shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you like a challenge." Emily couldn't help but laugh at that. "A challenge," she repeated. "I'm not sure I'm up for your challenge." Brian's lips curled into a half smile. "You're more interesting than you think." There was a strange tension between them, something unspoken that neither of them seemed ready to address. But Emily couldn't help herself. She was drawn to him, drawn to the mystery that surrounded him. And despite everything, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt whenever he looked at her. As they continued talking, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Brian wasn't like anyone she had ever met before. He was calm, composed, but there was something else there, something deeper that intrigued her. It was almost as if he was studying her, trying to figure her out in the same way she had been studying him since the moment they met. And for a brief moment, just a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to stop pretending. She allowed herself to admit that there was something more between them, something she couldn't ignore no matter how hard she tried. But when she looked up from her drink, she saw Clara approaching, her face set in a worried expression. Emily quickly stood up, feeling the tension between her and Brian shift. "I have to go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The bride needs me." Brian didn't try to stop her. He just watched as she walked away, his gaze following her every movement. Emily didn't look back. She couldn't. But even as she rejoined the other bridesmaids, the feeling that something had changed between her and Brian lingered. The wedding might have been over, but Emily had a sinking feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The night after the wedding, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The fleeting moments with Brian Fisher lingered in her mind, refusing to let her focus on anything else. His eyes, the way he carried himself, his effortless charm. It all seemed to come at her like a storm she wasn't prepared for. And the worst part? She had never been the type of person to be swept off her feet by anyone, especially not someone like him. She had been a bridesmaid for Clara, her best friend, and the night was meant to be a celebration of love, not a reminder that Emily's own heart could still be touched, still be moved in ways she hadn't expected. Her thoughts constantly returned to Brian. He was impossible to forget. And why? Because of how little he seemed to care about the chaos she had caused that night. He hadn't reacted the way she expected, with annoyance or anger. Instead, he had been calm, collected, even amused. The way he had handled her blunders made her feel both humiliated and in some twisted way admired. Her mind buzzed with thoughts, and her fingers hovered over her phone, unsure of whether she should text Clara or just shut everything out. It was the middle of the night, and she should have been asleep, resting. But sleep eluded her. She tossed and turned, trying to shake the feeling of Brian's gaze, trying to ignore the way his presence seemed to keep her on edge. It wasn't even just the attraction. It was the mystery that surrounded him, the complexity of his emotions and his ability to remain so calm and composed while she seemed to be falling apart. When she woke up the next morning, the weight of the night before still hung in the air. Emily had to face reality. She couldn't afford to let her emotions lead her anywhere, not with everything going on at work. She had projects to finish, deadlines to meet, and most importantly, Clara had warned her about Brian. She had made it clear that he was a dangerous man to get close to. Yet there she was, still thinking about him. She tried to distract herself with work, to dive into the designs, the blueprints, the endless list of things she needed to get done. But the more she tried to focus, the more Brian's face seemed to appear in her thoughts. It was maddening, and yet she couldn't escape it. She had made up her mind. She was just another woman who had been charmed by the billionaire CEO. It was nothing more than a fleeting connection. At least that's what she told herself. But something in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. Brian wasn't just any man. He wasn't like the others who came and went from her life. No, there was something different about him. He had this way of making her feel as if the world around her didn't matter, that his focus was on her, and it made her feel alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She had tried to avoid him after the wedding, staying out of his way, as much as she could at work. It wasn't easy though. Every time she walked into the office, his presence seemed to find her, whether it was in the form of a passing glance, a subtle comment, or just that feeling that he was always watching, always observing. Brian Fisher was a man who didn't just let things slide. He was always calculating, always reading between the lines. And the worst part? Emily couldn't help but feel like she was an open book in front of him, and that terrified her. As the days passed, Emily's emotions grew more and more tangled. She could feel the tension between them, thick and suffocating. Every interaction, every glance, every word spoken between them seemed to carry an unspoken weight. She couldn't figure out what Brian wanted, or worse yet, what he saw in her. What could a man like him possibly find intriguing in someone like her? She wasn't rich, she wasn't influential, and she wasn't used to this kind of attention. She was just a simple architect who had made a fool of herself in front of him. But the truth was undeniable. She wanted him. The more she tried to fight it, the stronger the pull became. There was something in Brian Fisher that called to her, something that made her feel like she was part of a story far bigger than herself. And no matter how much she tried to tell herself it was just infatuation, she knew it was something deeper than that. One afternoon, she walked into the office to find Brian standing by the conference room door, his back turned as he looked out, over the city skyline. He was wearing his usual suit, impeccably tailored, his posture perfect, and yet there was something in the way he stood that made her feel like he was waiting for something, or someone. Her breath caught in her throat as she hesitated in the hallway, unsure of how to approach. When he finally turned and caught sight of her, his gaze immediately locked onto hers. There was no mistaking the intensity in his eyes. For a moment it felt as though time stood still. Emily swallowed hard, her heart racing as she approached him, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Emily," Brian said, his voice low and calm, the way it always was. But this time there was something else in it, something beneath, the surface that she couldn't quite decipher. "Brian," she replied, her voice sounding more distant than she intended. She didn't want to sound indifferent, but the distance between them seemed necessary, both professionally and emotionally. "Can we talk?" he asked, his words hanging in the air between them. She tried to hide the nervous tremor in her hands as she nodded, leading the way into the conference room. The door clicked shut behind them, and suddenly the atmosphere felt charged, thick with the unspoken tension that had been growing between them for days. Brian took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been avoiding me," he said, the hint of amusement in his voice, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I haven't been avoiding you," Emily shot back, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I've just been busy with work." Brian tilted his head slightly, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing it looks like you've been avoiding me." She crossed her arms, trying to create some semblance of distance. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he asked, taking another step closer, closing the space between them. "Because it seems like you've been running away from something." "I'm not running from anything," Emily said firmly, though her heart was racing. She could feel the pull of his presence, the way he seemed to fill the entire room with just his energy. "I have a job to do." Brian's eyes darkened slightly, his gaze narrowing as he studied her. "You know, Emily, I'm not the kind of person who likes games." But I think you know that by now." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Emily felt the ground beneath her feet shift. She didn't know what game he was talking about, but she knew she was already playing it. They both were. "I'm not playing games," Emily replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed herself. She had been trying to convince herself that she was strong, that she could resist whatever this was. But now, standing so close to Brian, she wasn't so sure anymore. "You're not fooling anyone," Brian said quietly. "Not me. Not yourself." Emily's breath caught in her throat as his words hit too close to home. She knew he was right. She had been running from something. From him. From the truth. From whatever this strange connection between them was. "I don't have time for this," Emily said quickly, her voice faltering as she tried to pull herself back. She couldn't let herself get sucked in. She couldn't let him have this power over her. Brian didn't stop her as she turned to leave. But as she reached for the door, he said something that made her stop dead in her tracks. "I'm not going to let you run anymore, Emily," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "Not when I know what I feel." She couldn't move. His words echoed in her mind, and for the first time Emily realized that she wasn't the only one caught up in this. Brian Fisher, the man who had built his empire on control and power, was just as vulnerable as she was. And as much as she hated to admit it, she knew that this was only the beginning of something neither of them could control. The days that followed felt like an endless dance of uncertainty for Emily. Every encounter with Brian Fisher only seemed to deepen the tension between them, a palpable force that hung in the air. Each glance, each word exchanged felt like it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. The more she tried to fight it, the more she felt herself drawn to him. It was as though the universe had conspired to bring them together, pushing them into a scenario neither could control. At work, Emily couldn't escape Brian's presence. He was always there, whether it was in the corner of the room during meetings or his voice echoing in her mind long after their conversations ended. He was there, just a few steps away, yet always untouchable, and it wasn't just his proximity that unsettled her. It was his composed, unflappable demeanor, his ability to maintain control over everything around him, even when she was struggling to keep hers intact. She'd never met anyone like Brian. His focus, his confidence, and his unwavering presence seemed to create an invisible barrier around him, one that made everyone else feel like they were just in the background. But Emily wasn't just anyone else. She had spent most of her life trying to stand out, to make a name for herself in a world that constantly seemed to favor those who already had everything. And then Brian came along, a man who had it all: power, wealth, influence, and yet there he was, watching her, studying her, as though she were the only thing that mattered in the room. It was both flattering and terrifying. But what scared her the most was the fact that the more she tried to distance herself from him, the more she realized how much she wanted to be close to him. It wasn't just physical attraction, though there was that. It wasn't just his charm, though it was undeniable. It was the way he made her feel alive in a way that she hadn't experienced before. When she was around him, the world seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the intensity of their connection. And that, above all else, terrified her. She wasn't the type of woman to let herself be swept away by a man. She was strong, independent. At least she used to be. The turning point came when they were both at a corporate event. It was one of those fancy soirees where the wine flowed freely and people made small talk about projects and profits, about acquisitions and mergers. But all Emily could think about was Brian. He was there across the room, looking like he owned it all, dressed in his impeccable suit, a glass of scotch in hand, his eyes scanning the crowd with the same calculating gaze that always made her heart race. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but somehow she felt his gaze on her, as if he knew exactly where she was, what she was doing, even when their eyes never met. She tried to focus on the conversation she was having with one of her colleagues, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was maddening. She felt like a puppet on a string, and Brian was the one pulling the cords. She had never been so aware of another person's presence before, and it unsettled her. "Emily, you're doing it again," her colleague said, a teasing smile on her face. "You've been playing with your hair for the last 5 minutes. What's going on?" Emily blinked, realizing she had been nervously twirling a strand of hair around her finger. She felt her face flush with embarrassment. "Sorry, just distracted." "Distracted?" her colleague smirked. "By who?" Emily tried to force a smile, but it felt weak, hollow. No one. But she knew it was a lie. The one person who had been consuming her thoughts was standing just a few feet away. Brian Fisher. And as if on cue, she felt his eyes on her again. She didn't need to look to know he was watching. She could feel it like an electric current in the air crackling between them. She quickly turned her attention back to her colleague, trying to mask her nervousness. But it didn't work. She couldn't stop thinking about him. His gaze, his presence, his smile. It was like a drug and she was addicted. The night wore on and the tension between them only grew stronger. She could feel the pull, like a magnet, drawing her toward him, but she resisted. She couldn't let herself be caught up in this. She had a job to do, a career to build. And getting involved with Brian Fisher was a road that led to complications. She knew that. Everyone knew that. But the more she tried to push him away, the more she realized that there was no escaping him. She found herself constantly aware of his presence, of the way he seemed to know exactly when she was near, when she was thinking about him. And worst of all, he never seemed to let her forget it. Every time they interacted, he had this way of making her feel like she was the most interesting person in the room, like she was the only thing that mattered. It was infuriating and flattering at the same time. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was late in the evening when Emily found herself alone in the hotel's lounge, nursing a glass of wine and trying to calm the storm in her mind. She needed space, needed a moment to breathe and think. The last thing she wanted was to deal with the magnetic pull between her and Brian Fisher, but it felt impossible to escape. The night had been full of surprises, full of moments that she would never be able to forget, and she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. She heard footsteps behind her, steady and purposeful, and then his voice, low and measured, reached her ears. "Emily," Brian said, his presence filling the room. "We need to talk." She turned, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of him. He was standing just a few feet away, his suit still impeccable, his eyes intense and focused on her. There was no mistaking the seriousness in his expression. He wasn't here to talk about business. This wasn't a casual conversation. This was something else entirely. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it, Brian?" Took a step closer, and she could feel the heat of his gaze, the intensity of his presence. "You've been avoiding me." Her heart skipped a beat. "I haven't been avoiding you," she replied, though her voice was shaky, unsure. "I've just been busy." "Busy with what?" Brian asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Trying to forget about me." Emily crossed her arms, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I don't have time for games, Brian." "I'm not playing games," Brian said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I'm just trying to understand something." She tilted her head, confused. "Understand what?" He stepped closer, his face only inches away now. "You. I don't understand you, Emily. You're different." His words hit her like a shockwave. "I'm different?" she asked, taken aback. Brian nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're not like the others. You're not like anyone I've ever met before." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "I don't know what you're talking about." He didn't answer. Instead, he simply reached out and gently touched her arm, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. "Yes, you do," he said softly. "And the worst part is, so do you." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. There were no words left to say, no arguments left to make. Emily was left standing there, caught in the storm of emotions that had been swirling between them since the wedding. Brian was right. She knew what he meant. She knew exactly what he was saying. But the question was, what was she supposed to do about it? As the days continued to stretch on, Emily felt herself trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. Her relationship with Brian Fisher was like walking a fine line between control and chaos, between professional boundaries and something undeniably personal, something she could no longer ignore. It was clear to her that there was no turning back. She could feel the shift within herself, a shift that had begun the moment they locked eyes at the wedding, and it had only deepened with each interaction. In the weeks that followed, Emily's life became an intricate dance of carefully planned professional interactions, interrupted by moments of electric tension. The more she tried to suppress it, the more the attraction grew. What began as an accidental collision between them at the wedding had now transformed into something she couldn't quite define. Her heart, once closed off to love and romance, had opened in ways she never expected. Yet her mind remained steadfast in its battle against her heart. This was Brian Fisher, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country. She was just Emily Carter, a passionate architect trying to make her mark in a world where people like Brian could control everything with just a single phone call. The struggle was constant, the inner war between what she desired and what was expected of her. As much as she tried to focus on her work and separate herself from Brian, the pull between them was undeniable. At work, their interactions were always charged with that strange energy that seemed to bubble beneath the surface. He was the kind of man who dominated every room he entered, effortlessly powerful, a master of control, and completely aware of the effect he had on those around him. Emily, on the other hand, was someone who had always relied on her intellect and ambition to forge her path. She never needed anyone to validate her, never needed anyone to dictate her actions. But with Brian it was different. Then, one fateful evening, everything changed. It was a dinner meeting, one of those official gatherings where everything was supposed to be about business. Emily had tried to keep her emotions in check, knowing she had to be the professional, the one who was always in control. She had been so careful, so calculated in the way she interacted with Brian. But that night, it felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension between them, thick and almost tangible, and it was getting harder to ignore. She sat across from him at the restaurant, watching as he sipped his wine, his fingers casually swirling the glass. His suit was impeccably tailored, his posture flawless. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he was thinking about something more than just business. Emily tried to maintain her composure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had taken on a new, deeper meaning. It was as if the boundaries between them were starting to blur, and neither of them knew how to stop it. "So how's the project going?" Brian asked, his voice smooth but with a certain edge to it. Emily paused, staring into her wine glass before answering. "It's going well. We're making progress." "Progress?" he repeated, leaning forward slightly. "I thought you were always ahead of the curve. You usually have everything figured out." His words, meant as a compliment, felt like a challenge. He had a way of making everything feel like a test, as if he was constantly evaluating her, measuring her worth. Emily didn't mind it at first. In fact, she welcomed it. It pushed her to work harder, to prove herself. But now, sitting there with him, she realized that it wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about something far more complicated. She forced a smile, trying to stay in control. "I do my best." Brian's gaze never wavered, and for a moment Emily wondered if he could see right through her, through the layers she had carefully built around herself. "I'm sure you do," he said quietly, his voice soft but laden with meaning. "But I think you're hiding something, Emily." Her heart skipped a beat. He was right, of course. She had been hiding something. Hiding the way he made her feel. Hiding the way her body reacted whenever he was near. She had spent so much time building walls around her emotions, pretending they didn't exist, that she hadn't even realized how deeply she had fallen for him until now. The realization hit her like a wave, and it left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she never had before. Brian tilted his head slightly, as if reading her thoughts. "It's okay, you know," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to hide from me." The words felt like a whisper of surrender, but Emily wasn't ready to admit the truth to herself, let alone to him. She looked away, focusing on the wine in her glass. "I'm not hiding anything." Brian's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't the usual confident smirk he wore. There was something softer in it, something that made Emily's heart race even faster. "I think you are," he said, "but that's all right. I'm patient." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Emily's mind was spinning, her heart racing. She had been so careful, so calculated, and yet here she was, vulnerable in a way she never thought she'd be. It terrified her, and yet part of her couldn't help but feel relieved. Maybe it was time to stop running from what she felt. Maybe it was time to face the truth. "I don't know what you want from me, Brian," Emily said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I want you, Emily," he replied, his voice calm but filled with undeniable intensity. "I want you to stop pretending that you don't feel this." His words were like a spark, igniting something inside her that she couldn't ignore. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to push him away, to keep the walls up, to maintain her independence. But another part of her, the part that had been silent for so long, urged her to let go, to allow herself to feel something real for once. "I can't do this," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too complicated." "I know it is," Brian said, his voice steady. "But sometimes the most complicated things are the ones worth fighting for." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, before Emily finally looked up at him. "And what if I'm not ready?" Brian studied her for a moment, his gaze searching her eyes as if he were trying to see into her very soul. "You will be," he said softly. "In time." The night ended quietly, the tension still lingering in the air, neither of them sure what to say next. Emily walked away from the restaurant that evening with more questions than answers, her mind a swirling mess of emotions. She knew that something had shifted between them, something irreversible, and for the first time she wasn't sure whether she was ready to face it. But deep down, she knew that there was no turning back. The connection between her and Brian Fisher had already been forged, and no amount of resistance could undo it. She just didn't know yet what that meant for her future, for her career, or for the life she had carefully built. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the days continued to stretch on, Emily felt herself trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. Her relationship with Brian Fisher was like walking a fine line between control and chaos, between professional boundaries and something undeniably personal, something she could no longer ignore. It was clear to her that there was no turning back. She could feel the shift within herself, a shift that had begun the moment they locked eyes at the wedding, and it had only deepened with each interaction. In the weeks that followed, Emily's life became an intricate dance of carefully planned professional interactions, interrupted by moments of electric tension. The more she tried to suppress it, the more the attraction grew. What began as an accidental collision between them at the wedding had now transformed into something she couldn't quite define. Her heart, once closed off to love and romance, had opened in ways she never expected. Yet her mind remained steadfast in its battle against her heart. This was Brian Fisher, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country. She was just Emily Carter, a passionate architect trying to make her mark in a world where people like Brian could control everything with just a single phone call. The struggle was constant, the inner war between what she desired and what was expected of her. As much as she tried to focus on her work and separate herself from Brian, the pull between them was undeniable. At work, their interactions were always charged with that strange energy that seemed to bubble beneath the surface. He was the kind of man who dominated every room he entered. Effortlessly powerful, a master of control, and completely aware of the effect he had on those around him. Emily, on the other hand, was someone who had always relied on her intellect, an ambition to forge her path. She never needed anyone to validate her, never needed anyone to dictate her actions. But with Brian, it was different. Every time they spoke, the words felt like a challenge, like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. It wasn't just about his words. It was his gaze, the way he studied her with those piercing blue eyes, as if he were searching for something deeper, something hidden. The air around him seemed to hum with his presence, and no matter how much Emily tried to brush it off, she couldn't escape the sensation that he was always watching her, always calculating. Then, one fateful evening, everything changed. It was a dinner meeting, one of those official gatherings where everything was supposed to be about business. Emily had tried to keep her emotions in check, knowing she had to be the professional, the one who was always in control. She had been so careful, so calculated in the way she interacted with Brian. But that night it felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension between them, thick and almost tangible, and it was getting harder to ignore. She sat across from him at the restaurant, watching as he sipped his wine, his fingers casually swirling the glass. His suit was impeccably tailored, his posture flawless, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was thinking about something more than just business. Emily tried to maintain her composure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had taken on a new, deeper meaning. It was as if the boundaries between them were starting to blur, and neither of them knew how to stop it. "So how's the project going?" Brian asked, his voice smooth but with a certain edge to it. Emily paused, staring into her wine glass before answering. "It's going well. We're making progress." "Progress?" he repeated, leaning forward slightly. "I thought you were always ahead of the curve. You usually have everything figured out." His words, meant as a compliment, felt like a challenge. He had a way of making everything feel like a test, as if he was constantly evaluating her, measuring her worth. Emily didn't mind it at first. In fact, she welcomed it. It pushed her to work harder, to prove herself. But now, sitting there with him, she realized that it wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about something far more complicated. She forced a smile, trying to stay in control. "I do my best," Brian's gaze never wavered, and for a moment, Emily wondered if he could see right through her, through the layers she had carefully built around herself. "I'm sure you do," he said quietly, his voice soft but laden with meaning. "But I think you're hiding something, Emily." Her heart skipped a beat. He was right, of course. She had been hiding something. Hiding the way he made her feel, hiding the way her body reacted whenever he was near. She had spent so much time building walls around her emotions, pretending they didn't exist, that she hadn't even realized how deeply she had fallen for him until now. The realization hit her like a wave, and it left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she never had before. Brian tilted his head slightly as if reading her thoughts. "It's okay, you know," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to hide from me." The words felt like a whisper of surrender, but Emily wasn't ready to admit the truth to herself, let alone to him. She looked away, focusing on the wine in her glass. "I'm not hiding anything." Brian's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't the usual confident smirk he wore. There was something softer in it, something that made Emily's heart race even faster. "I think you are," he said. "But that's all right, I'm patient." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Emily's mind was spinning, her heart racing. She had been so careful, so calculated, and yet here she was, vulnerable in a way she never thought she'd be. It terrified her, and yet part of her couldn't help but feel relieved. Maybe it was time to stop running from what she felt. Maybe it was time to face the truth. "I don't know what you want from me, Brian," Emily said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I want you, Emily," he replied, his voice calm but filled with undeniable intensity. "I want you to stop pretending that you don't feel this." His words were like a spark, igniting something inside her that she couldn't ignore. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to push him away, to keep the walls up, to maintain her independence. But another part of her, the part that had been silent for so long, urged her to let go, to allow herself to feel something real for once. "I can't do this," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too complicated." "I know it is," Brian said, his voice steady. "But sometimes the most complicated things are the ones worth fighting for." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, before Emily finally looked up at him. "And what if I'm not ready?" Brian studied her for a moment, his gaze searching her eyes as if he were trying to see into her very soul. "You will be," he said softly. "In time." The night ended quietly, the tension still lingering in the air, neither of them sure what to say next. Emily walked away from the restaurant that evening with more questions than answers, her mind a swirling mess of emotions. She knew that something had shifted between them, something irreversible, and for the first time she wasn't sure whether she was ready to face it. But deep down, she knew that there was no turning back. The connection between her and Brian Fisher had already been forged, and no amount of resistance could undo it. She just didn't know yet what that meant for her future, for her career, or for the life she had carefully built. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the days went on, Emily could feel the growing tension between her and Brian Fisher, a tension that she could no longer ignore, no matter how hard she tried. It was as if the universe had conspired to keep them together, throwing obstacle after obstacle in her path. Every time she thought she could escape, he seemed to appear in her life again, pushing her further towards something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The truth was, Emily had been running from her own feelings for weeks. She had spent so much time pretending that nothing had changed since the wedding, when they first collided in that hotel hallway. She had convinced herself that her attraction to him was nothing more than a fleeting moment, a temporary spark that would fade away with time. But it didn't. If anything, it had only intensified, growing stronger with each passing day. At work, she tried to keep things professional, keeping a distance from Brian despite the magnetic pull that seemed to draw them together. Every time their eyes met across the office, she felt her pulse quicken, her breath catch in her throat, and every time he spoke to her, his voice calm and collected, yet laced with an undeniable intensity, she had to fight the urge to let her guard down. She had to remind herself that this was business, not some whirlwind romance. After all, she was just an architect, and Brian was the CEO of one of the biggest financial consulting firms in the world. They lived in two entirely different worlds, but the more she tried to suppress her feelings, the more they bubbled up, pushing against her carefully constructed walls. She had never allowed herself to get emotionally involved with anyone. Her focus had always been on her career, on proving herself, on making a name for herself in the world of architecture. She didn't have time for distractions, especially not distractions like Brian Fisher. It was late one evening when she found herself walking out of the office, her mind swirling with the day's meetings and the endless tasks that awaited her the following morning. She was tired, mentally and emotionally drained, and all she wanted was to get home and forget about the whirlwind of emotions that had been swirling inside her for weeks. But as she stepped into the dimly lit parking garage, she saw him again. Brian Fisher, standing near his sleek black car, his presence as imposing as ever, his eyes fixed on her. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing at the sight of him. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her with that knowing look in his eyes. It was as if he could see right through her, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. Emily tried to ignore the sudden rush of heat that flooded her body. She couldn't deny it anymore. She was drawn to him, despite her best efforts to resist. "Can we talk?" Brian's voice broke the silence, his tone calm but firm, as if there was something urgent that needed to be addressed. Emily hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with a million thoughts. She could easily walk away, pretend that nothing had happened between them, that the tension between them was just in her head. But something in his gaze, something in the way he stood there, waiting for her, told her that this wasn't just another casual conversation. This was something more. She could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, hanging between them like a storm just waiting to break. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, her steps slow but deliberate. "What is it, Brian?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart beating faster with every step she took. Brian didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his eyes lingering on her face as if he were trying to read her, to understand her in a way no one else could. The tension between them was palpable. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. "I can't stop thinking about you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity that caught her off guard. Emily's breath caught in her throat at his words. She had known deep down that this was where they were headed. She had known that eventually the walls they had both built around themselves would crumble, and the truth would come out. But hearing him say it aloud, hearing the raw honesty in his voice made everything feel real, made it impossible to pretend anymore. "I've been trying to ignore it," Brian continued, his voice lower now, as if confessing a secret. "Trying to convince myself that this, whatever this is between us, doesn't matter. But it does. It matters more than anything else." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had spent so much time running from her feelings, convincing herself that they didn't matter. But Brian was right. They did matter. And the longer she tried to deny it, the harder it became to fight against the pull that was drawing her to him. "I don't know what to say," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked down at the ground, trying to avoid his gaze. She couldn't let him see how much his words had affected her, how much they had shaken her to the core. Brian reached out, gently lifting her chin so that their eyes met once again. "You don't have to say anything, Emily. I just need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to let you run away from this anymore." His words were like a jolt of electricity coursing through her veins. She had been running from her emotions, from the connection they shared, but in that moment she realized that there was nowhere left to hide. She could no longer pretend that she didn't feel what she felt for him. "I don't know if I can do this," Emily said, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I'm not like you, Brian. I don't have the luxury of just giving in. My career, my life, they don't fit into whatever this is. I've worked too hard to get where I am." Brian's expression softened, and he stepped closer to her, his presence overwhelming but comforting all at once. "I know," he said, his voice filled with understanding. "But sometimes the things that matter most don't always fit into neat little boxes. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith, and I'm asking you to take that leap with me." Emily felt a surge of emotion rise within her. She wanted to say no, wanted to walk away and bury her feelings deep down where they couldn't hurt her. But the truth was, she couldn't do that anymore. She had spent so long running, so long hiding from what was right in front of her, and now she realized that it was time to face it. "I don't know what will happen," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I can't keep pretending that this doesn't matter." Brian's smile was slow, but it was full of promise. "Neither can I." In that moment, something shifted between them. The air, once thick with tension, now seemed lighter, filled with the possibility of something more. Emily didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to find out. As Emily walked into her office the next morning, she could feel the weight of the decision she had made. She had finally given in. Finally, allowed herself to embrace the feelings she had tried so desperately to suppress. The kiss with Brian the night before had felt like a reckoning, the moment when everything she had been running from came crashing down around her. It was a moment of surrender, one that she had feared and longed for in equal measure. But as she entered the building, a part of her still struggled to process the whirlwind of emotions that had taken over her life. She had always been so independent, so focused on her career. She had built her life around structure, around purpose. But now, with Brian Fisher in the picture, all of that seemed to crumble. The wall she had erected around her heart had been shattered, and she was left standing in the rubble, unsure of what to do next. The office felt different today. The usual hum of activity, the chatter of colleagues, the rustle of papers, all seemed to fade into the background. Emily's mind was elsewhere, on the conversation with Brian, on the lingering warmth of his touch, on the way his eyes had looked at her, as though she were the only person in the room. It was a gaze that had unsettled her, made her feel both vulnerable and desired. She had never allowed herself to be the center of anyone's attention before. It had always been about her work, her ambitions, her goals. But now there was this undeniable pull, this magnetic force that seemed to draw her to Brian in ways she couldn't explain. She sat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she organized the papers in front of her. She tried to focus on the Richmond Tower project, tried to block out the thoughts of Brian that were swirling in her mind, but it was impossible. She could still feel the heat of his touch, the softness of his lips on hers, the way his voice had sent shivers down her spine. She had told herself that she wouldn't let him distract her, but the truth was he already had. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and emails, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to make a choice that could change everything. Brian had opened a door inside her, a door she had spent so many years keeping locked, and now she wasn't sure if she was ready to step through it. At lunch, she walked through the city streets, trying to clear her mind. The world around her felt distant, as though she were in a bubble, separate from everyone else. Her thoughts kept circling back to Brian, to the way he had made her feel. She had always told herself that love and relationships were distractions. They were something to be avoided, something that could derail her career, her carefully constructed life. But now she wasn't so sure. Maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe there was more to life than just work, just ambition. She passed the cafe and glanced inside. It was bustling with people, the noise of conversation and clinking cups filling the air. For a moment she considered going inside, grabbing a coffee to settle her nerves. But then, as though on cue, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Brian. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon, and part of her wanted to ignore the message, to pretend it wasn't there. But the other part, the part that had been resisting, this connection between them, knew that she couldn't. She couldn't hide from it anymore. She turned around and headed back to the office. The walk back felt longer than it had earlier, as though the weight of the decision she was about to make was getting heavier with every step. She wasn't ready to face Brian. She wasn't ready to confront the feelings that had been building between them. But as she walked into the building, she knew that she didn't have a choice. It was time to face the truth. When she arrived at her desk, she found Brian standing there waiting for her. His presence was commanding, as always, but there was something different about the way he looked at her. He wasn't the cold, calculating businessman she had seen in the meetings. Today his eyes were soft, almost vulnerable, and Emily couldn't help but feel the pull of his gaze. "Emily," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken emotion. "We need to talk." She nodded, unable to find her voice. The words were stuck in her throat, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She followed him to the small meeting room at the back of the office, her footsteps echoing in the silence between them. Once inside, Brian turned to face her, his eyes intense and unwavering. "I know this isn't easy," he began, his voice low, "but I can't keep pretending that you don't matter to me." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't what she had expected. She had imagined this conversation 100 times, in 100 different ways, but never like this. She had imagined fighting him, resisting him, pushing him away. But instead, she found herself standing there, her emotions swirling in a way she couldn't control. "I've been thinking about us, about everything that's happened," Brian continued, his eyes searching hers. "And I know this isn't just some fleeting moment for me. This is real. I want this. I want you, Emily." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with a force that left her breathless. She had never heard him speak like this before. He had always been so guarded, so controlled, and now here he was laying his heart bare in front of her. It was terrifying, and yet it felt right. She couldn't deny the way her heart had been drawn to him, the way every fiber of her being responded to him. But she was scared, scared of what this meant, scared of what would happen if she let him in completely. "I don't know what to say," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "This is also overwhelming." Brian reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "You don't have to say anything right now. I just need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here and I'm not letting you go. Not this time." The words hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of their meaning. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, letting the gravity of his declaration wash over her. She had spent so long running from this, from him, from the vulnerability that came with allowing someone else into her life. But now, standing here with him, she realized that maybe she had been running from the wrong things all along. "I don't know what this means," Emily said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But I can't ignore what I feel either." Brian's smile was slow, warm, and full of understanding. "We'll figure it out together," he said softly. "One step at a time." In that moment, Emily knew that everything had changed. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and there was no going back. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to go back. She wanted to move forward to see where this connection with Brian could take them. She stepped closer to him, her heart racing in her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to take the leap, to let go of the fear that had held her back for so long. She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. "I'm ready," she said, her voice full of resolve. "Let's take that step together." And with that, they began a new chapter, one that would challenge them, push them, and ultimately lead them toward a love they never expected but both desperately needed. As they walked out of the room together, hand in hand, Emily couldn't help but feel that for the first time, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of Emily and Brian teaches us that sometimes the most unexpected moments can lead to life-changing experiences. It's a reminder that love isn't always neat or planned. It can come when we least expect it, shaking our foundations and making us confront our deepest fears and desires. The key takeaway from this journey is that opening our hearts to new possibilities, even when we are afraid, can lead to something beautiful and transformative. Life has a way of guiding us toward what we truly need, even if it takes a little chaos to get there. Let Emily and Brian's story inspire you to embrace the unknown, to take risks, and to trust in the process of love and self-discovery. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and support our channel. Your encouragement gives us the motivation to bring you more captivating stories and emotional journeys. Stay tuned for more.